afternoon to all the members of the media who are here, fellow members of BOSA, and fellow South Africans. I think all of us are conscious of the fact that the elections that took place brought about a very seismic shift in the politics of our nation. It began a journey upon which a new form of national coalitions had to be established. And many of us would know very well that what has now become a government of national unity is an outcome of a number of parties who have come together. I recall quite deliberately the days when we began engagements with the African National Congress pertaining to our role on the government of national unity. And much of it spoke to the fact that we were intentional about what we wanted to see and why it was important for us to make the decisions that we made to remain a constructive voice in opposition. That we want to ensure that the success of the government of national unity does not undermine the role of accountability, but also that given that 70% of the parties that are now in parliament form part of the GNU. So you cannot have a successful GNU without a successful and a constructive opposition. It is on that basis that we take this press briefing wanting the success of the government of national unity, but also being conscious of some of the issues that may emerge. Let me start off by saying there have been some positive things that obviously have occurred. Part of being constructive is to recognize when visas have been cleared up. Part of being constructive is to recognize when we've been able to say, how do we chart our way in the next while that begins to focus and attend on the work that parliamentarians have been doing in fighting to hold the executive to account. But along with that, there are certain things that are starting to occur 100 days on. The first of those being policy disagreements. It is common cause that at one level, the DA and the ANC perhaps could not come to a point of agreement on matters like the Bella Bill, on matters like the NHI, and furthermore, the manifestations have resulted in what is the omni-shambles that are taking place in Tshwane as we speak. I call them that because you cannot afford to have a local government that remains unstable over a period of time and leads itself to what Johannesburg is faced up to, which is a revolving door of mayors. Along with some of those difficulties, I think the efficacy and the working of government has been such that the counterweight of parliament has seen many MPs working together, but it is quite clear that outside the executive, there's still a lot of work that must be done in being able to demonstrate to South Africans where the GNU goes in a country where more than half the citizens of this country are living below the upper poverty line. So the first milestone that we've got to put on the table is that the GNU cannot just be a matter of getting along to go along. It cannot be an exercise of saying, how do we keep the executive with all the appropriate security, VIP protection? It must actually now, more than ever, focus itself on saying, how do we deliver a plan that is credible, that is accountable, that will ensure that all citizens benefit? My hope was that by now, we would have had a conversation between the wealthy, or what is in some ways defined as the market, because market sentiment has been positive around the GNU, but we must have also had a conversation amongst poor South Africans as to what their experience of the GNU is. That conversation is long overdue in this country, and if we do not have that conversation, the net consequence of it means that you lead a country of the haves and the have-nots, multiple South Africas, and more worryingly is the fact that whilst others might be driving around in blue lights and security, the majority of citizens are confronted with the question of 80 people being murdered every single day in this country. For those South Africans, the legacy issues that have occurred before the GNU have continued to plague them. It is why, on that basis, as BOSA, we begin by saying we want to give the GNU in its first 100 days a 50% score. I know that is higher than the previous administration's pass mark, but at least is still in some ways a start towards what we need to make sure that the risk that the GNU is faced up to is that if it does not succeed, the threats to South Africa become even more compounded. Let me raise on what basis we make that particular score. The first is that there is no concrete or tangible plan that has been tabled before the people of this country. The promise of a national dialogue is long overdue, and ultimately, like other plans before, if in the first 100 days you don't signal to society which direction you want to go, you create other elements where people feel that anything then is possible. The reason why it's important also for this plan is that the lessons we've learned from the National Development Plan is that often the National Development Plan does not quickly become translatable into annual performance plans so that you can hold the government to account. Already, with 6 years to go to 2030, the objectives of the National Development Plan are not going to be attained. So this idea that the organizing plan must be the National Development Plan is in fact a fallacy. What we need to do is actually create something that is tangible, measurable, that will guide the plans of all citizens, both those in the executive, in parliament, and in other sectors of society, to coalesce towards delivering a prosperous future for all South Africans. I want to pick up on a few. We will touch collectively on 5 key areas. The first begins with the issue of the economy. South Africa's economy has been growing at 1% on average in the last 10 years. That has meant that South Africa is fiscally under pressure. And as we head towards the midterm budget statement, it's going to be important that we demonstrate where ultimately excess revenue is to be found so that we can invest in decaying infrastructure and ensure that we can begin to point the economy in the right direction. Whilst, given the economy has experienced a sentiment, a positive boost, driven by a 5.8% appreciation of the rand, much of the optimism can be credited to reforms initiated under President Ramaphosa's previous administration, particularly in areas of fiscal stability and governance. What is now needed in the government of national unity is to harness that energy, that momentum, and actually direct to crucial areas. To use business confidence to deliver employer and employee confidence, that more and more people can find work in this country. For what we cannot do is that in the name of GN euphoria, ignore the fact that too many people still remain unemployed in our country. We welcome the stabilization of energy, but it is clear that it is going to be a fundamentally important policy direction as we transition from carbon-intensive energy to energy that is sustainable. And therefore, these are areas that the government of national unity cannot afford to be in disagreement over. We need to channel that energy renewal plan along with working with the national logistics crisis, so that we can ensure that ports and Transnet are far more effective in going forward. Let me say, the question of redress cannot be left up to debate. Whilst there are policy differences between the DA and the ANC on this issue, we cannot be debating how we include South Africans who are left behind, especially as a function of history. The ongoing debates on BBBEE, minimum wage, labor laws, need to be resolved urgently, for it is the burning pain that South Africa faces. Too many South Africans, particularly South Africans who are black, have been left out of the economy. I use a very simple example. I was in Katoras, outside Katlehong. When we arrived in Katlehong, we want to stimulate the township economy. It is clear that historically, because of government's behavior, it has allowed SMMEs who are sitting inside communities like Katlehong outside. And worse, in certain instances, there isn't a direction of legislation that can be passed urgently that will stimulate that sector of the economy. I want to highlight that as BOSA, as we continue to fight for, in fact, tax rebates, relaxed labor laws, ensuring that townships are special economic zones, these cannot be hampered by policy disagreements that sit within the GNU on issues of redress. This is a step that will ensure more and more citizens are included in the economy. And ultimately, if you want to talk about tangible benefits for all citizens, let those be felt. I want to touch a little bit on this issue of crime and safety. No economy is going to grow without a safe place for all citizens, businesses, and society at large. State capture was a project described as when politicians are able to garner resources of government. What we are also starting to see is a different form of crime, which is a mafia-type crime, on issues of extortion, and in other instances where, in fact, businesses figure out a way to coalesce together to damage some of the government's departments. I look at issues like medical legal claims, issues like the road accident fund. These are matters that need to be attended to urgently, that we deal with that type of white-collar crime, extortionary in its nature. But along with that, for ordinary citizens at home, 80 murders a day is insufficient. And this, to me, is a red flag when it comes to the government of national unity. Minister Mkhunu came to lament the same without tabling a refreshed plan as to how we deal with crime. The sooner the GNU resolves this matter, I want to assure you, citizens who are most affected by crime will not be the first ones to celebrate the work of what's happening with GNU. And therefore, along with 135 rapes daily, this is an urgent priority that this GNU cabinet must face up to. Issues of corruption have continued to plague historically what was happening inside the government, but even still today, corruption is something that we can ill afford. And therefore, the recent case of the Minister of Justice, Thembisa Melani, I think is an important opportunity for President Ramaphosa to demonstrate an opportunity where he can show decisive leadership on corruption and a break from the past. She has to be held accountable. along with anyone else who was involved with the VBS scandal. This is not selective. You cannot have a Minister of Justice who still, at this point in time, has some challenges or some questions and accusations of corruption on this issue. So along with many others, I think it's going to be important that we don't practice the old issue of saying, how can these matters be handled elsewhere? The government of national unity must be able to produce a high level of transparency. I'm going to, before I hand over to Nobuntu Hlazo-Webster, who's the deputy leader of BOSA, highlight that along with the work that we're doing as BOSA is upholding constitutional and lawmaking process. Therefore, when we look at issues even as Nobuntu will touch on education, it cannot be that in the processing of law, in the name of GNU, the president can be lobbied privately. If any law in South Africa is deficient in its provisions, all the president needed to do was to send it back to Parliament. But you can't sit and say you will phone a private individual, because you can imagine if all of us had objections to the law and the president had our private numbers or we had his private number, could we phone the president and ask for halting of certain clauses? It cannot be such. And therefore, I think if the 6th administration was about state capture, may the 7th administration be about Parliament doing its job in the refreshed energy of the government of national unity. Let me hand over to you.
Touch on the issue of education and review the GNU's performance in the first 100 days in education. We always have to keep in mind what we have always maintained as BOSA being one of the key challenges in education in South Africa, and that being the fact that we have two education systems in this country. You have an education system that's for the rich and an education system that's for the poor. And so it is a positive development that there's been an advancement of the Bela Bill. But as has been mentioned by our leader, the challenge that you then have in the GNU is that of opposing thinking when it comes to certain policies like the Bela Bill, and that becoming an enabler for the private lobbying that you see, that becoming a pathway to have the kind of lobbying, private lobbying, that we saw when it comes to the Bela Bill. What ultimately the Bela Bill should be about, and what ultimately this administration should be about, is creating equity in the quality of education, as well as in addressing the systemic inequalities that we've seen in education, getting to a point where we can say and confidently be able to support what we call one education system versus what we've seen before. And so while it's welcome that there's advancement and progress in that, you have the challenge of the policy differences, which might be a threat even to the implementation of the Bela Bill. What we also welcome is the commitments that we've heard from the department in improving school infrastructure, and notably is the eradication of pit toilets. One of the biggest injustices of our education system has been the dignity that's stolen from children in schools where there are still pit toilets. And so that is important and that is critical. But the challenge becomes what we've seen as a pressing challenge, in fact, that is about the departmental budget cuts that are taking place and the potential of reduction, first of all, in the resources that schools would need, but also in teachers and in posts that sit for teachers in some provinces. Now that's a daunting reality, and that's a challenge that this administration and the GNU is going to have to make sure that it addresses head on. So the 9 provincial education departments will require another 79 billion and a maximum of 118 billion by 2024 to fund the programs. And so the GNU is going to have to prioritize sustainable funding and enhance supporters for educators and make sure that in order to implement this legislation, there is indeed funding that is available to that. Another area that has actually challenged the GNU, and I think will continue to do so, is that of healthcare. And we can speak and welcome and cheer, and people can make a noise about policies that come into play. But what matters and what we have to speak about, and what we always underscore, is the issue of what is the change in the life of the 61 million. And so can we confidently say that over the past 100 days, there have been changes in the education, in the health system for the 61 million? Are there changes in the resources and in the facilities that South Africans have to access? And we don't think that's the case. And so when you look at the debates that sit with NHI, again, another opposing force when it comes to the GNU, and another a threat to the GNU and its stability. But when you look at that and you look at that policy, you can have a discussion and you can have a debate about whether it will be good for South Africa, whether it is implementable, given actually even the infrastructure challenges that sit in the healthcare system. But what's most important is to ask the question, are South Africans receiving better healthcare since the GNU has been in place? Now, what we know for sure is that in 2024, it's reported that 1 in 5 infants are not fully immunized by their first birthday still. 3 in 10 children in South Africa display stunted growth. 1 in 25 children die before their 5th birthday. That's still a reality. We are in communities and we hear from communities about how they still cannot access primary healthcare facilities, how old people still have to wait days on end in order to be able to get access. They will come to a primary healthcare facility and find that actually they are being turned back early in the morning by 7 a.m. There are resource deficiencies in primary healthcare facilities and in hospitals where people are not getting treatment. So while we still have corruption in the healthcare system, while we still have mismanagement in the healthcare system, and we're not dealing with those issues, we can't say that there's been any improvement for the 61 million South Africans in the healthcare system. Lastly, I'm going to touch on effective government. We can talk about policy and we can talk about plans and strategies all we want. You could even put maybe the right people in roles, but if you do not have the right efficient government in place, that all falls apart, that all crumbles. So first of all, as the leader had mentioned before, there's a lack of general cohesive policy direction in the GNU. And so you can have the issues of Bela Bill, NHI Bill, it can even be passed, but you will struggle if you don't have cohesiveness in government to be able to implement those policies. And that is the challenge and a threat that the GNU faces. The biggest threat, and one actually that we are seeing in Parliament, is that you have 70% of Parliament that sits in the GNU. That means that 1 in every 5 MPs serves as a minister or a deputy minister. And so what then happens is that you have an issue of the weakening of accountability in Parliament. And that is something that as Build One SA, we have committed to make sure that we take that role and we hold that role of holding the executive accountable, of holding this administration accountable. It is a role that we have been playing over the past 100 days in Parliament. It is a role that we will continue to play in this 7th administration, in this 7th Parliament. You have a situation where even the GNU, in the way that it's comprised now, does not have formalized coalition agreements. And so at any point, over any disagreement, it can break. You're seeing what is happening in local government. Some of the issues that are happening in local government with parties that sit together in the GNU. And you then have the knowledge that you have a real threat to the stability of the GNU because there are no agreements that sit in place that hold those parties together and that ensure that they are in agreement in the way that they work together and in putting the citizens of South Africa first and the residents of the various municipalities first. And so we're committed as Build One South Africa to playing that role of constructive opposition, of accountability. We sit in 6 committees in Parliament, and that's the role that we're playing. It's a role that we will continue to play, and it's a role that we are committed to.
Thank you.